Take all heavy industry, all polluting industry, and move it into space and keep Earth as this beautiful gem of a planet that it is.
India opened up its space sector for private players. The result was this. More than 200 space startups have come up in India in the last 3 years.
India's worth in satellite launch services could double to $1 billion.
The US government remains by far the leader when it comes to space funding. China is also becoming a major player.
The global space economy is going to be the next big thing. Currently valued at $630 billion, it is expected to explode to $1.8 trillion by 2035. Now, when you hear space economy, you probably think about Elon Musk and SpaceX, or billionaires going into space for tourism, or ISRO launching satellites for science to the moon or to Mars. But that is really just the tip of the iceberg. According to the Space Insight report from the World Economic Forum, space tourism and exploration actually account for just about 5% of the $660 billion space economy as of 2023. And by 2035, its share will shrink even further to just 2.5% of the $1.8 trillion market. And SpaceX by Elon Musk or Blue Origin by Jeff Bezos are not alone. Just in India, the number of space startups has gone up from just 1 in 2014 to 189 in 2023. And several other countries are now joining the space race, including Japan, Saudi Arabia, and Thailand. So now, if it is not tourism or research exploration, how is space going to be a $1.8 trillion industry? Why do all these private and government players suddenly seem in a rush to go to space? And will India win this industry like it did with IT, or will it fall behind like it did in the semiconductor race? While I will give a detailed account of India versus China and US and who is currently winning space later in the video, let's understand what the space economy really consists of. Space economy means any activity that develops, uses, and manages space resources. This includes everything from building rockets to launching satellites or space stations using those rockets and then using that satellite data in any way. But what you may find surprising is that these satellites power so much more than we realize. For example, Uber, Zomato, and Zepto all use the services and API of Google Maps, which is based on GPS. And GPS itself works on data that is continuously gathered from a network of satellites in space. So without satellites, apps like Uber or Zomato could never become billion-dollar companies. And with all these applications requiring satellites, the number of satellites around the Earth is exploding exponentially. As of April 2024, Earth has almost 10,000 satellites in space, and about 8,000 of these were launched in the last 5 years alone. But this can get confusing. So let me help you understand and classify this better. You see, space applications can be divided into two types: backbone applications and reach applications. Backbone consists of the core infrastructure and services that make space operations possible, which includes satellites, rockets that launch them, and ground and space stations that control them. On the other hand, reach applications consist of utilizing the technology and data from satellites in space, and then using it for applications like GPS or mobile networks. Reach applications reach the end customer directly, but they rely on the infrastructure provided by the backbone applications. So backbone applications in the space economy mainly consist of launching satellites, exploration and research, and military defense, while reach applications mainly consist of services built on data from space, like communications and PNT, which is short for positioning, navigation, and tracking. Another crucial thing to note here is that in the backbone segment, the revenue goes directly to the space hardware and service providers like SpaceX, while in reach, it goes to companies that build applications on top of the space data like Google Maps or Uber. So now we understand the two different types of applications that generate revenue in the space economy. Now let's look at the revenue contribution of these two. As of 2023, the space economy is worth $660 billion, out of which backbone is the majority and accounts for $330 billion or 53%, while reach accounts for $300 billion or 47%. However, by 2035, the entire economy will grow to $1.8 trillion. And interestingly, reach will become bigger than backbone. Out of the $1.8 trillion, reach will account for over $1 trillion or about 58%, while backbone will account for about $750 trillion or just 42%. So the applications built on the data provided by satellites are going to surpass the core satellite business altogether. And this, by the way, is also what happened to the internet. You might be paying rupees 600 per month for your Wi-Fi connection, but you would spend more than that for OTT services like Netflix, Amazon and Hotstar alone. It took me 2 weeks to do the research for this video. So please subscribe to my channel if you made it this far. Moving on. Now, this was a classification based on the types of applications. But to understand what is really driving the growth in space economy, we need to look at who are the drivers of these applications. Space economy is driven by two sectors. The first is the commercial sector, where private companies like SpaceX launch satellites to earn from them, and Google or Uber build services on space data to earn from them. As the name suggests, the end goal of the commercial sector is to generate revenue. Then comes the state-sponsored sector, where state-owned space agencies and companies like NASA, ISRO or ESA do the work, like sending satellites for scientific space exploration or military defense applications. The primary goal here is not to generate revenue. Now, the contribution of the state-sponsored sector is relatively smaller in the overall space economy. Recall that the space economy is about $660 billion as of 2023. Out of this, the state-sponsored sector contributes $156 billion or about 25%, while the commercial sector drives the majority of the economy with a 75% contribution. And by 2035, the contribution of the state-sponsored sector will shrink even further to just 22%, when it is expected to contribute just $400 billion to the $1.8 trillion economy. The driver of the growth will largely be the commercial sector, which is expected to contribute 78% of the space economy by 2035. Now, this commercial sector of 75% can be broken down into two types of applications that we already talked about: backbone and reach. So let's see what each of these consists of. In the commercial backbone segment, we have communications, positioning, navigation and tracking or PNT, and rocket and satellite manufacturing, among others. Then, in the commercial reach segment, we have communications, PNT and others. Now, just to be clear, we can see communications and PNT in both the backbone and the reach segments here, but there is a difference. In the backbone segment, the communications and PNT revenue represents physical equipment and services, which involves making and launching the satellites and then maintaining the ground stations. While in the reach segment, the communications and PNT revenue represents services built on the data from these satellites, like accessing GPS on Google Maps or the internet. So clearly, whether it is the backbone or reach, two segments are going to be the biggest drivers of growth in the space economy, and that is communications and PNT. So I'll explain both of these one by one, starting with communications. This is a list of countries corresponding to the number of satellites that they currently have in space. And you will see that the US is way ahead of any other country. But note here that a large majority of these satellites are commercial, which means that it is not really the US government or NASA that is doing all the heavy lifting. So who is driving all these satellites up in the space on behalf of the US? Well, here is the answer to that question. You will see that SpaceX by Elon Musk owns more than half of all the satellites currently in space. And the reason why SpaceX is launching all these satellites at a breakneck speed is Starlink. If you don't already know, Starlink is a satellite internet service that can provide high-speed internet to even the remotest areas of the world. You see, currently, if you have a Wi-Fi at your home, it is likely powered by a fiber optic cable. The problem with this cable internet is that it needs a very large network of cables. Spreading all these cables needs a lot of time as well as money, and it is financially viable only in densely populated areas where a lot of people subscribe to it. So the drawback is that it is capital intensive to set up, and last mile coverage is only possible in main cities. This is where satellite based internet systems like Starlink come in. Instead of transferring the data through cables, Starlink transfers the data through a vast network of satellite systems up in the sky. The satellite in the sky transmits the data, and you have a Starlink kit on the ground that receives that data. But satellites in the sky keep orbiting around the Earth. So in order to ensure that a satellite is always present over an area, you need thousands of satellites orbiting the Earth in the sky at all times. And this is precisely why Starlink tops the list of the number of satellites. SpaceX has already launched about 6,000 Starlink satellites as of April 2024, and it plans to eventually have 42,000 satellites up in the sky. It already has 2.2 million Starlink customers worldwide, and Elon Musk expects to eventually see a $72 billion market for Starlink in the US alone. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it immediately targeted its internet with cyber attacks and physical attacks. Ukraine was left with practically no internet and communication within a few days. It was Elon Musk who came to Ukraine's rescue as he started supplying free Starlink kits to Ukraine, so they could access the internet from anywhere safely. Ukraine's military communications were restored, all thanks to Starlink, and if it was not for them, who knows what would have happened. That is the power of satellite-based internet. And SpaceX is not alone. Jeff Bezos is already working on its own satellite internet system named Kuiper with a similar goal. And even Mukesh Ambani has a similar plan for India with his geospace fiber services. The demand for internet data is expected to increase by 60% between 2023 to 2035. And the demand in data and networks will need more satellites and space hardware, which is why communication will be the biggest thruster of the commercial backbone segment of the space economy. Then we move on to the second most important sector, and that is PNT, or positioning, navigation and tracking. As the name says, it is an application where you use satellites to track the position and movement of any device. Now, the reason why PNT is so small in the backbone segment but so gigantic in the reach segment is because it needs limited space hardware. To enable position tracking and navigation, you only need a limited satellites up in the sky. Once those satellites are set up and position tracking is enabled, you can build a gigantic range of services all around it. A very simple example of this is ride-hailing services like Uber. As I said earlier, Uber uses the GPS API offered by Google Maps. Now, whether Uber is using that API to track 100 cars or 10,000 cars, the number of satellites needed will remain roughly the same. And that number is extremely small. Unlike Starlink that will need over 40,000 satellites, GPS actually works on just 27 satellites. There are only 31 GPS satellites orbiting the Earth right now. 27 are active and 4 are kept on standby as reserves. So when PNT services like Uber will grow from 1 million users to 10 million users, the space hardware and satellite requirement and backbone contribution of the PNT segment will remain largely the same, while the reach contribution will grow exponentially. The global ride-hailing business alone is expected to grow from $63 billion in 2023 to $300 billion by 2034. And then, positioning and tracking is going to be used by a host of other sectors as well. The food and beverage sector will need it for efficient last mile delivery of perishable items. E-commerce services will use it to track their orders. Media and sports will use it for tracking devices. And finally, the governments will use it for defense tracking and disaster management. So this is how PNT will account for almost $800 billion worth of commercial reach applications by 2035. And communication and PNT are just two. There are other miscellaneous applications as well, as I already mentioned earlier. So now you understand what is the depth and significance of the upcoming explosion in the space economy that we are going to see very soon. But after doing all this research, the question that I had was, where does India lie in this race? And the answer that I found was quite unexpected. ISRO has been making a lot of headlines in recent years, be it for launching a Mars mission that was 10 times cheaper than its US counterpart, or for the Chandrayaan-3 becoming the first lunar mission to land on the moon's south pole. And since India indeed is one of the pioneers in space research and science, you would think that India would have a significant share of the global space economy, right? Well, I thought that too. But then I did some research and I was surprised to find out that India has a share of just 2% in the global space economy. Even if you consider the metric of the most number of satellites in space, India is way behind. The USA leads the list thanks to Starlink, and it is closely followed by China. India is actually at the 6th number. China has about 8 times more satellites than India, while the US has almost 46 times more. While this data is about a year old and present numbers may vary slightly, you get the idea. So now, you might be thinking that if India is one of the handful of countries that have an established space agency, an agency which is able to launch space missions at 1/10 of the price, why have we been unable to capture a bigger share of the market? Well, to understand the answer, recall how I explained earlier that state-sponsored satellites for research are only a small segment of the space economy. It's the commercial players that drive most of the progress, as has been the case with SpaceX. But sadly, until 2020, the space sector in India was heavily regulated by the government. ISRO was the only body responsible for all space activities in India, be it manufacturing satellites and rockets or controlling the launch bases across the country. the involvement of the private sector was very limited, where private companies only acted as suppliers and contractors of ISRO. These companies helped ISRO only in manufacturing, while research, development, design, and innovation were all handled solely by ISRO. Now, it wasn't that it was illegal for a private company to design and launch its own rockets. It was just that there was no framework whatsoever for them to take action. So if someone wanted to launch a SpaceX-like company in India before 2020, he simply could not, because it would have required specific permissions directly from ISRO, and even ISRO didn't know how to grant those permissions. On top of it, all major space infrastructure like launch pads and tracking stations were owned by ISRO, with no easy way for private players to access them. Pixel is a satellite startup founded in Bangalore in 2019, and its founder Awais Ahmed says that back in 2019, they once went to ISRO to book a satellite launch. But ISRO turned him away and said, "We don't even have a procedure to launch an Indian satellite." That is how clueless and unregulated the sector was. And it was because of all this neglect, India saw minimal growth in the space economy. But the government finally realized that ISRO alone cannot cater to the rising demand in the space sector, and the government could only provide a limited amount of money. India needed private funding to become competitive. So in 2020, the Modi government opened up the space sector for private players. It deregulated space activities and approved private participation in the entire sector. And to facilitate this, it established the Indian National Space Promotion and Authorization Center, or INSPACE, under ISRO, which guides and promotes private companies in space activities. Private players were also granted access to ISRO's infrastructure, scientific resources, and all of their data. ISRO was split, and a new commercial arm was formed under it named New Space India Limited, or NSIL. While ISRO continues to do scientific research and development work, NSIL was established to exploit the R&D work done by ISRO commercially on a global scale. And more recently, in April 2024, the government amended the Foreign Direct Investment, or FDI, rules for the space sector. In order to tap into international capital and money, India has allowed up to 74% FDI for satellite manufacturing and operation, and up to 49% FDI for launch vehicles or rockets without prior government approval. Before this, FDI of any percentage was allowed only with prior approval from the government, which was tedious and time consuming. While these measures are rather recent, they are definitely a step in the right direction. The number of space startups, as I already mentioned, have gone up from just one startup in 2014 to 189 in 2023 when it comes to India. And InSpace aims to increase India's share in the global space economy from 2% right now to 8% by 2033. So space really could be the next IT industry for India, where India powers global operations with excellence at a fraction of international costs. When SpaceX is full or busy or expensive, people will need alternatives. China is not really a viable option due to geopolitical tensions. No one really trusts it right now. So politically and economically, India is in an excellent position to capture this demand. If you made it this far, subscribe here and follow me on LinkedIn and Instagram. The link is in the description below. Until I see you in the next video, goodbye.